The morning Oliver Covington rode onto the Sullivan land, with a repossession notice folded inside his breast pocket. He had no idea that the sight of one woman working alone in a wheat field would unravel every certainty he had ever carried about himself. The year was 1874, and the territory of Kansas was a place where fortunes were made and broken with the same indifferent speed as the prairie winds that swept across the flatlands from November through March. Oliver had ridden out from Dodge City just after dawn, his bay gelding kicking up red dust on the dirt road that wound between the low hills and the creek bed. He had done this kind of work before, collecting on behalf of the First Territorial Bank of Dodge City, presenting notices, explaining terms, occasionally escorting stubborn homesteaders off land that was no longer legally theirs. It was not glamorous work, but it was steady, and Oliver Covington was a man who had always valued steadiness above glamour. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the summer heat and gray eyes that had a habit of going very still when he was thinking hard. He wore a simple brown vest over a white shirt, his denim trousers tucked into worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days but still kept the sun off his face. There was no star pinned to his chest. He was not a lawman, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had learned that most difficult conversations went easier if you spoke low and stood steady. The Sullivan homestead came into view around a long bend where a cottonwood grove broke the flat horizon. He could see the farmhouse first, a modest but well-kept structure of timber and sod, with a covered porch that faced east and a kitchen garden running along its southern wall. There was a barn, smaller than the house, and beyond that a stretch of cultivated fields that surprised him. He had expected neglect. He had expected the evidence of failure that usually preceded a repossession: unworked soil, collapsing fences, livestock wandering untended. What he found instead was a farm that was clearly fighting to live. And then he saw her. She was in the wheat field, perhaps 100 yards from the road, moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone who had been doing this same work since before the sun was fully up. She wore a wide straw hat against the Kansas heat, a pale cotton dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she was pulling weeds from between the rows of young wheat with both hands, tossing them into a pile at the end of each row before moving to the next. Even from a distance, Oliver could see the determination in her posture, the set of her back, the purposeful way she moved from one row to the next without pausing to rest. He pulled his horse up at the fence line and sat for a moment, watching. He was not the kind of man who lingered. His work demanded efficiency, but something held him there on the road, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other loose at his side, just watching this woman work land that he had come to take from her. She noticed him eventually. She straightened, pushed a loose strand of dark auburn hair back from her forehead, and looked across the field at him with an expression that was not frightened, not welcoming, but perfectly level. Then she picked up her pile of weeds and walked to the end of the row and began on the next one, as if he were nothing more than a traveling stranger who had paused to rest his horse. Oliver dismounted, tied his gelding to the fence post, and walked to the edge of the field. "Good morning," he called out, removing his hat. "I am looking for the Sullivan homestead. I was told this was the place." She did not stop working. "You found it," she said, loud enough to carry across the rows without being raised in anger. "Are you Mrs. Sullivan?" She paused then and stood and turned to look at him squarely. Her eyes, he noticed even from the distance between them, were a remarkable shade, somewhere between green and brown, lit up by the morning sun. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with a quality about her face that was not conventionally pretty in the way of parlor paintings, but was striking in the way that honest, lived-in faces often are. "Miss Sullivan," she said. "Edna Sullivan. My father passed away last winter." She paused, letting that land. "What is your business here, Mr. Covington?" he said. "Oliver Covington. I am with the First Territorial Bank out of Dodge City." Something moved across her face, a quick tightening around the eyes, a compression of the lips, and then it was gone, and the levelness returned. She set down her handful of weeds, removed her work gloves, and walked to the edge of the field where he stood at the fence. Up close, she was taller than he had expected, and younger-looking, though there was nothing girlish about the steadiness of her gaze. Her hands were roughened from work, her dress dusty at the hem, and there was a smudge of dark earth along her left forearm. She looked him directly in the face, which many women in 1874 Kansas did not do with strange men, and she said, "How long do I have?" The directness of it caught him off guard. He had expected tears or arguments or the particular kind of desperate bargaining that homesteaders sometimes fell into, trying to trade promises against debt. He had not expected this calm, this utterly level question, asked in the same tone someone might use to ask about tomorrow's weather. "The notice is for 30 days, he said. "After that, the bank has the legal right to—" "I know what the bank has the legal right to do," she said, not unkindly. "My father borrowed against this land when the winter took the cattle. He believed the spring wheat would cover it. It did not." She looked out over the field. "This year's wheat will cover it if I have the time to bring it in." Oliver followed her gaze. The wheat was young but healthy, green gold in the morning light, moving in a slight wave when the breeze came through. He knew enough about farming, he had grown up in Indiana on his uncle's property before the war pulled everything apart, to recognize that she was right. If this crop came in as it promised, it would generate enough to address at least a portion of the debt. "The bank is not in the business of farming," he said, which was the standard reply he gave in these situations. "No," Edna said, "it is in the business of taking farms." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "Would you like some water, Mr. Covington? You have ridden a distance." He stood on the road for a moment, looking at this woman who had just received what amounted to a death notice for her home and was now offering him water, and something inside his chest performed a peculiar shifting motion that he did not have an immediate name for. "That would be kind of you," he said, after a pause that lasted a beat too long. She led him to the porch, where a ceramic pitcher sat on a small table in the shade. She poured a cup and handed it to him and then leaned against the porch post with her arms folded, watching him drink, her expression thoughtful. "Is there someone you report to?" she asked. "Someone who makes the final decisions about these notices. Mr. Harlan Prout runs the land division at the bank," Oliver said. "But the notice is legally binding unless the debt is—" "How much?" she asked. "The full amount, what my father owed plus the interest they have added." He hesitated, then told her. She received the number without flinching, though he could see her jaw tighten briefly. "If I sell this year's wheat harvest at a fair price," she said, "I can cover 2/3 of it. If I sell the 2 remaining horses and the farming equipment except for the minimum I need, I can cover the other third." She looked at him steadily. "But I cannot do any of that if I am removed from this land in 30 days. Oliver looked out at the fields, at the young wheat, at the carefully tended kitchen garden, at the mended fence line that she had clearly repaired herself. He thought about the notice in his breast pocket, and he thought about Harlan Prout sitting at his desk in Dodge City, already thinking about what the bank might do with this parcel of land. "I will carry your proposal back to the bank," he said, and then stopped, because he realized he had just said something that was not part of his instructions. He had been sent to deliver a notice and confirm the condition of the property, not to negotiate. Edna looked at him with those remarkable hazel eyes and said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Covington." He handed back the cup, settled his hat on his head, and walked back to his horse. He untied the reins and stood for a moment with one hand on the saddle, looking back at the farmhouse, at the field, at the woman who had walked back to the porch steps, and was watching him with an expression that was very carefully composed, as if she had long since learned that hope was something you kept banked down low, so it would not burn you when it failed. He rode away without delivering the notice. He told himself, on the long ride back to Dodge City, that he had simply needed to verify the condition of the property before proceeding, that he would submit the notice by mail, that he had done nothing professionally improper. He told himself these things with considerable conviction and believed precisely none of them. The town of Dodge City in the summer of 1874 was a bustling, noisy, complicated place. The cattle drives along the Kisham and Western trails brought cowboys and drovers pouring through every season, and the Long Branch Saloon was rarely quiet before midnight. The businesses along Front Street, the general store, the two hotels, the blacksmith, the barber shop, the bank, operated with the relentless energy of a place that was making itself up as it went along. It was a town of opportunity and also of considerable injustice, where land and law and money were often controlled by the same small group of men, and where a widow or an orphaned daughter fighting to keep a homestead had very few advocates. Oliver knew this. He had worked for the bank for 3 years, and he had seen enough of how Harlan Pruitt operated to understand that the man's interest in repossessing properties had less to do with recovering bank debt, and considerably more to do with accumulating land that he could then sell to larger ranching operations at a profit. The Sullivan homestead sat on good water. There was a creek that ran along the north border of the property, and Pruitt had mentioned more than once that the land was better suited to grazing cattle than growing wheat. What he meant, though he never said it plainly, was that he already had a buyer waiting. Oliver went to see Pruitt the morning after his ride to the Sullivan farm. Harlan Pruitt was a wide man, running to fat at the jowls and middle, with small eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular kind of expansive good cheer that prosperous men who have never genuinely struggled sometimes wear as a mask over ruthlessness. He sat behind his desk with his suspenders on and his coat off, and he received Oliver's report with a nod and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Condition of the property?" he asked. "Better than expected," Oliver said. "The woman has kept it up. The wheat crop is healthy. She may be able to bring in enough to address a significant portion of the debt by harvest." Pruitt's expression did not change, but something shifted slightly behind his eyes. "The bank's position is clear, Covington. The debt is in default. The 30-day clock runs from the date of notice delivery." "I have not yet delivered the notice," Oliver said. A pause. Pruitt looked at him over his glasses. "Why not?" Oliver had prepared an answer. "The woman is alone on the property. She made a proposal regarding the harvest that I thought warranted consideration before I left the notice and created a hostile situation. It seemed prudent." Pruitt studied him for a long moment. "Deliver the notice today," he said. "By end of week." Oliver nodded, folded his hands, and said, "I would like to request a 60-day extension on the delivery." The pause this time was considerably longer. "On what grounds?" "The harvest will come in within 45 to 50 days, given the current growth. A 60-day window would allow the bank to assess whether the debt can be recovered without the costs associated with a repossession proceeding. Legally and practically, it may serve the bank's interests better." This was a lie. Or rather, it was a truth deployed in service of an outcome that had nothing to do with the bank's interests, and everything to do with a woman standing in a wheat field with dirt on her forearm and a perfectly level gaze. But it was a persuasive truth, and Oliver had learned long ago that the most effective arguments in business were ones where your actual motive and your stated motive arrived at the same place. Pruitt drummed his fingers on his desk. 60 days, he said finally. "And you will report on the property's progress at 30 days and again at 50. If there is any indication the harvest will not cover the debt, the notice goes immediately." "Agreed," Oliver said. He walked out of the bank into the summer heat of Front Street and stood for a moment on the boardwalk, hat in hand, feeling the sun on his face and the peculiar sensation of having just done something that was simultaneously the most professionally questionable and the most personally correct thing he had done in 3 years. He rode back to the Sullivan farm the following morning, not because he had any official reason to do so, but because he told himself he needed to inform the property owner of the bank's terms. Which was true. He just did not examine too carefully why he had made the 15-mile ride at dawn when a letter would have served the same purpose. Edna was in the field again. He was beginning to think she was always in the field. This time she saw him coming from a distance and walked to the fence to meet him, which he found he liked more than he should. She was wearing the same straw hat and a different dress, blue this time, faded but clean, and she had her sleeves rolled up again and a look on her face that was braced for bad news. "You came back," she said. "I spoke to the bank," Oliver said. He dismounted and stood at the fence, turning his hat in his hands. "They have agreed to a 60-day assessment period. If the harvest covers the debt, the notice will not be executed." Edna stared at him. For the first time since he had arrived at her property, the composure slipped just briefly, just a flicker of something raw and genuine moving across her face before she pulled it back. She pressed her lips together and looked out at her field, and when she looked back at him, her eyes were bright. 60 days, she said. 60 days, he confirmed. She exhaled a long, slow breath and nodded. "Thank you," she said, and then seemed to feel that this was insufficient. "I do not know why you did that." "You did not have to do that, but thank you." He wanted to say something honest, but everything honest felt dangerous, so he said, "The bank's interest is in recovering the debt, not acquiring property. A working farm is more valuable than an empty parcel." She looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew exactly how much of that was true and exactly how much was not. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. He accepted. He knew he should not. He accepted anyway. The inside of the Sullivan farmhouse was spare but not poor. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 4 mismatched chairs, a bookshelf along one wall that held a surprising number of volumes, curtains at the window that had been hemmed and rehemmed so many times they were more patched than original cloth. There was a framed photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. A man and woman, stiffly posed in the way of photographs of the era, with a small girl between them who had the same stubborn set to her jaw as the woman now pouring coffee at the stove. Oliver sat at the kitchen table and watched Edna move around the small kitchen with the ease of someone who knew every inch of the space by memory. She set a cup in front of him and settled into the chair across the table with her own cup between her hands, and she looked at him with those direct hazel eyes and asked, "Where are you from originally, Mr. Covington? You do not sound like Kansas." "Indiana," he said. "My family had a farm outside of Indianapolis. I came west after the war." "You served?" "I did, Union cavalry near the end. I was 17 when I enlisted." He paused. "You?" "I grew up in Ohio," she said. "My father came out here in 1862 when I was 13. He believed in the land." She glanced at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "My mother died on the journey west, fever. My father and I built this place from nothing." She said it plainly, the way you state facts that have been grieved so long they have calcified into simple history. "I am sorry," Oliver said. "She would have loved it here," Edna said, and for a moment something soft and unguarded moved through her face. She was the kind of woman who put her hands in the earth and made things grow. "My father used to say she could talk to plants," a small smile. "I think I inherited that from her. I cannot talk to them especially well, but I am stubborn enough to stay after them until they give up and grow." Oliver smiled, a real smile, which felt unexpected on his face after the professional neutrality he had been maintaining, and Edna noticed it, and her own smile widened slightly, and the kitchen felt very small and very warm. They talked for an hour, which was longer than Oliver had talked with anyone in a long time outside of professional necessity. He learned that Edna had managed the farm entirely alone since her father's death the previous January, that she had hired 2 local hands for the planting season, but could no longer afford to pay them after March, so she had been managing alone since April. He learned that she had taught herself to do the fence repairs by studying her father's notes, that she kept the farm accounts in a leather ledger with the same meticulous care she applied to her rows of wheat, that she had not been to Dodge City since February and had no particular desire to go. He told her about his years in Indiana, and about the way the war had made him restless, unable to return to farming after coming back from it, which was why he had ended up in bank work, not because he loved it, but because it was steady and it kept him moving. She listened with the kind of genuine attention that people who are often alone sometimes have completely, without planning what to say next. When he stood to leave, she walked with him to the porch, and they stood for a moment in the afternoon sun, squinting out at the fields, not quite ready to end the conversation. "Will you come again?" she asked, and then seemed briefly startled by her own directness. "For the 30-day assessment, I want to be prepared. I will come at the 30-day mark," he said, and he paused, and the honest thing and the professional thing diverged again, and this time the honest thing won without much of a fight. "I may ride out sooner if I am in the area, to check on the crop progress for the report." Edna looked at him steadily and said, "The area is not much on the way to anywhere else, Mr. Covington." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She smiled, a real one this time, not the small, careful smile from before, but a full one, warm and slightly wry, the kind of smile that rearranged a face. "I will have coffee ready," she said. He rode back to Dodge City in the late afternoon light with a kind of unsettled elation that he did not trust and could not suppress, and he spent the evening sitting on the porch of his rented room above the hardware store trying to read a newspaper and failing completely. He went back to the Sullivan farm 5 days later, and then 4 days after that. He told himself the first visit was to check on the crop. He stopped trying to justify the second one. Edna was always working when he arrived, in the field, or in the garden, or repairing something, or carrying water from the creek. And she would set down whatever she was doing and walk to meet him with that same directness, and they would fall into conversation the way people do when they have discovered they are genuinely interested in each other's minds. She was sharp-minded, better read than he was, with opinions about things that surprised him. She had been following the reports of the Red River War, and had clear, complicated feelings about the displacement of the Comanche and Kiowa people from the Southern Plains, feelings that she expressed with a careful fairness that Oliver found both admirable and challenging, because it required him to examine his own assumptions. She talked about Kansas politics with a precision that would have been impressive in any man, and was, in 1874, remarkable in a woman managing a homestead alone. She asked him questions that were direct and genuine, and seemed to actually want his answers. He found himself thinking about her in the mornings, which was inconvenient, and in the evenings, which was worse, and occasionally in the middle of conversations with other people, which was professionally problematic and personally unavoidable. The trouble arrived at the 20-day mark, in the form of a conversation Oliver overheard at the Long Branch Saloon, where he had stopped for a meal after a long day of other bank business. He was at a corner table when he heard Harlan Pruitt's voice at the bar. Pruitt was there with a large, wide-shouldered man in expensive trail clothes whom Oliver recognized as Wade Tanner, a Texas rancher who ran cattle up through the Kansas Territory and had been buying land along the creek corridors for 2 seasons. Oliver did not move, and he kept his face toward his plate, and he listened. "The Sullivan parcel has good water," Pruitt was saying, his voice low and satisfied. "Creek runs the full north border. 60 days she cannot make the debt. I have your assurance on the price." "My assurance stands," Tanner said. "Soon as the title is clear, we close within the week." Oliver set down his fork very carefully. The understanding arrived with the cold clarity of creek water. Pruitt had never intended to let Edna Sullivan bring in her harvest. He had agreed to the 60 days knowing she couldn't realistically raise the full debt in that time from the harvest alone, and the assessment at 30 days would give him the justification he needed to accelerate the notice regardless. The 60-day agreement had been a performance. He sat for a while after Pruitt and Tanner left, thinking. Then he went to see a man named Abe Shepard, who was the closest thing Dodge City had to an independent solicitor, a lawyer from back east who had come west for his health and stayed for the work, and who had a small office above the land registry that smelled of tobacco and old paper. Oliver had known Shepard casually for 2 years and knew him to be one of the few men in Dodge City who did not owe Prute anything. He laid out the situation plainly. The debt amount, the harvest projections, the conversation he had overheard, and his own assessment of the property. Shepard listened with his feet up on his desk and his pipe going steadily, and when Oliver finished, the lawyer sat quietly for a long moment. "What are you asking me to do, Covington?" "I am asking you to tell me if there is any legal avenue that protects her interests, any filing, any mechanism under the homestead provisions, anything." Shepard took his pipe out of his mouth and looked at Oliver with the expression of a man who has just worked out a calculation he did not expect. "You know this will likely cost you your position at the bank," he said. "I know that," Oliver said. "Does the woman know you are here?" "No." Shepard put his pipe back in and puffed for a moment. "There is a provision under the Homestead Act of 1862, he said slowly. "That provides some protections for the original claimant's direct descendants. If her father filed the original claim and she has been maintaining continuous occupation and cultivation, which it sounds like she has, there may be grounds to contest a forced repossession on the basis that the debt arrangement was secondary to the original homestead claim." He paused. "It is not a certainty. It would require filing and it would require documentation, and Prute has lawyers of his own. But it could be done. It could be attempted," Shepard said carefully. Oliver stood up. "Draw up the filing," he said. "I will cover the initial cost." He rode to the Sullivan farm the next morning at a pace that was faster than prudence warranted, pushing his bay gelding along the flat road, while the early sun came low and amber across the prairie grass. He was thinking about what Edna would say, and he was also, he admitted to himself at some point between the creek crossing and the cottonwood grove, thinking about the way she had smiled at him when he left the last time, that particular smile, the warm one, the real one, the one that did something inconvenient and irreversible to his chest. She was at the fence when he arrived, not working, for once, but leaning on the post and looking out at the field with a frown of concentration on her face that smoothed when she saw him riding up. Then something in his posture or his speed must have warned her, because the frown came back, more careful this time. "Something has happened," she said, before he had fully dismounted. "Yes," he said, and told her everything: Prute's arrangement with Tanner, the overheard conversation, Shepard's assessment, what he had asked the solicitor to file. He told it plainly and quickly and watched her face move through surprise and then fury and then a cold, clear settling like water going still after a stone. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You are going to lose your position over this," she said. "Possibly," he agreed. "Why?" she asked. And it was the same directness she had used the very first day, the same quality of question that expected an honest answer and would accept nothing less. Oliver stood at the fence with his horse behind him and the morning sun in his face and looked at Edna Sullivan, and he made the decision to tell the truth, because every other option felt like a kind of cowardice he was no longer willing to practice. "Because the day I rode up this road with a notice in my pocket and saw you working in that field," he said, "I was not able to do it. I could not leave that notice and ride away. I do not know how to explain that more completely than to say that I tried to be practical about it, and I could not manage it, and I have not managed it since." Edna looked at him for a very long, still moment. The prairie wind moved through the wheat field behind her, and somewhere across the property a horse stamped in the barn, and the morning was so quiet that Oliver could hear his own heartbeat with more clarity than he found comfortable. "Oliver," she said, using his given name for the first time, which she had not done before, "you are a very honest man." "I am trying to be," he said. She pushed off the fence post and stood straight and said, "Come in. I need to see that filing." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours with Shepard's preliminary documents spread between them, and Edna read every word with the focused attention she gave everything, asking sharp, precise questions that forced Oliver to think harder than he had expected. She was not a passive recipient of rescue. She was a partner in strategy, and she had ideas that Oliver had not considered, including a set of receipts and correspondence from her father's original homestead filing that she produced from a locked box under her bed, which Shepard would later confirm significantly strengthened their legal position. When they had gone through everything, Edna made fresh coffee and set a plate of biscuits on the table that she produced from somewhere with the ease of a woman who baked as a matter of course, and they sat across from each other in the afternoon quiet of the kitchen and drank coffee and ate biscuits and talked about something entirely other than bank proceedings. Oliver asked about the books on the shelf, and Edna talked about them with an enthusiasm she had clearly been keeping banked for want of anyone to share it with. She was working through a collection of essays she had ordered from a catalog, and she had opinions about all of them, and she was reading a novel that she described with a kind of animated precision that made him want to read it immediately just to have more to say to her about it. He stayed until the evening light started going golden, and when he stood to leave, she walked with him to the porch as she always did, and this time when he turned to say goodbye, she was closer than she usually stood, or he had moved closer without noticing, and the distance between them was very small. "You should know," she said, looking up at him with those hazel eyes in the evening light, "that I have not allowed myself to hope for very much in a long time." It seemed the most practical response to my circumstances. "I know the feeling," he said quietly. "But," she said, and paused, and he thought he might not breathe until she finished the sentence. "I find that I am hoping for things now that I had convinced myself were no longer possible." "Such as?" he managed. She looked at him for a moment with a quality of courage that he recognized, because it was the same courage it had taken him to tell her the truth an hour ago. "Such as the possibility that a person can come to know another person very well in a short time, and that this is not foolishness, but simply luck." The word hung between them in the warm evening air, and Oliver felt the last of his professional composure dissolve entirely, because it was simply not equal to this woman, and he had known it for some time. "I do not think it is foolishness," he said. She nodded once slowly, and then she stepped back to give them both room to breathe. "Good evening, Oliver." "Good evening, Edna." He rode home in the dark and arrived at Dodge City long after the saloons had gone quiet, and he sat on his porch in the still night and looked at the stars for a very long time. The legal challenge occupied the next 2 weeks with a ferocious intensity. Shepard was thorough and quick, and the documents Edna had produced from her father's filing proved to be exactly as significant as he had hoped. They established that the original homestead claim predated the bank's lending arrangement, and that the terms of the debt had been structured in ways that may not have been fully transparent to Gerald Sullivan at the time of signing. This was not, Shepard was careful to say, a certainty of victory, but it was a genuine case. Prout found out about the filing within days. A town as small as Dodge City had no real secrets, and summoned Oliver to his office with a coldness that Oliver recognized as the precursor to something final. "You have filed on behalf of the Sullivan woman," Prout said. He was not asking. "I connected her with legal counsel," Oliver said. "That is not improper." "It is improper when you are employed by this bank to act on its behalf," Prout said. "You are terminated effective immediately. Clear your desk." Oliver received this without expression and said, "The filing stands regardless." "The filing is a nuisance," Prout said. "It will be resolved." "Perhaps," Oliver said. "That will be for the court to determine." He walked out of the bank with 3 years' worth of professional stability in a box under his arm, and a feeling in his chest that was less like fear than like the particular lightness that comes when you have finally put down something heavy that you did not realize was weighing you down. He went to see Shepard, who received the news of his termination without surprise and with the particular serenity of a man who had seen this kind of thing before. "The case is filed," Shepard said. "The hearing date is set for 5 weeks out. Your employment status does not affect the legal proceedings." "What are my chances of finding other work in this town?" Oliver asked. "Prout has influence," Shepard said honestly, Enough to make things uncomfortable. You are good with a horse and with accounts. There is always work on the ranches for a man who can do both." He paused. "Or there is the possibility of going elsewhere." Oliver thought about this. Elsewhere had been his natural state for most of his adult life. He had always been a man who moved when things became difficult or complicated, and he had always told himself that this was not running away, but simply the logical response to changed circumstances. Looking at it plainly now, sitting in Shepard's tobacco-scented office with the afternoon sun cutting through the window, he found that elsewhere had significantly less appeal than it once had. He rode out to the Sullivan farm that same afternoon. Edna was on the porch when he arrived, sitting in the cane-back chair with her ledger open on her knee, and she looked up when he came down the road and set down her pen. By the time he had dismounted and tied his horse, she was at the porch steps, reading his face. "He let you go," she said. "He did," Oliver confirmed. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her, and said, "I want you to know that I have no regrets about it. And I want you to know that I am not telling you that to create any sense of obligation. I did what I did because I believed it was right, not to manufacture a claim on your gratitude." Edna came down the porch steps slowly and stood close in front of him and said, "Oliver Covington, do you believe I am the kind of woman who mistakes gratitude for other things?" "No," he admitted. "I do not." "Good," she said. "Because what I feel toward you has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the fact that you are a serious, honest, decent man who makes me feel less alone in the world." She held his gaze without blinking. "That is a remarkable thing. I did not have it before. I am not inclined to dismiss it." He reached out very slowly and took her hand, her work-roughened, capable hand, and held it between both of his, and she let him, and the evening birds started up in the cottonwoods along the creek. "I would like to stay," he said. "Not in any capacity that is not welcome, but I would like to stay in this place, and I would like to know you better, and I believe I could be useful if you would let me." "I always have coffee ready," she said softly. He laughed, and she laughed too, and the sound of it in the prairie quiet felt like something new beginning. He found lodging at the farm of a neighbor named Clem Hatcher, 2 miles down the road, a weathered widower who ran sheep and needed help with the fence line and the shearing, and who was willing to offer a room and meals in exchange for labor. Oliver threw himself into the work without complaint, and spent his evenings riding over to the Sullivan farm or sitting with Shepard going over documents, and the weeks passed with a texture and a warmth that surprised him. The harvest came in 3 weeks after Oliver had lost his position at the bank, and it was everything Edna had predicted: abundant, golden, the wheat standing tall and heavy-headed in the late summer heat. Oliver was there for the cutting, and so was Clem Hatcher, who arrived with a scythe and a solemn expression and worked without being asked, which was the particular form of kindness that prairie neighbors had. A man named Douglas Chen, who had come from California a decade earlier and ran the only general store in the small settlement closest to the Sullivan land, also appeared with 2 of his sons and cut wheat without fanfare, and stayed for the supper that Edna cooked afterward, a simple, generous meal that somehow produced enough to feed everyone. Oliver worked beside Edna through the long, hot days of the harvest, and there was something between them in that shared labor, a current that ran without words, a steadiness that had grown from the strange and improbable beginning of their acquaintance into something deeply rooted. He learned the particular way she moved when she was tired but refusing to stop, and she learned the way he went quieter when he was concentrating, and his mouth set in a line that was not unhappy but focused. They did not speak a great deal during the harvest work, but they were always aware of each other, and the awareness was warm and particular. In the evenings after supper, they sat on the porch in the cooling dark and talked until the stars were fully out, and the coyotes started their distant conversations across the flats. They talked about everything and nothing, about what they believed and what they had given up believing and what they had started, tentatively, to hope for again. She told him about her father, the real version, not just the facts of his illness and his debts, but the man himself, his humor and his stubbornness, and his habit of talking to the horses as if they were people, which Edna had inherited and which she confessed to with a slightly self-conscious smile. He told her about the war, the parts he could tell, not the battle parts, which were not stories for a porch in summer, but the parts about what it had done to his sense of home, how it had made him feel for a long time like rootlessness was a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. "Do you still feel that way?" she asked, one evening when the moon was coming up over the eastern hills. He looked at her in the moonlight, sitting in the cane-back chair with her knees drawn up and her hair loose for once, down around her shoulders, dark auburn in the white light, and he said, "No, not lately." She looked at him steadily, and the current between them was very strong, and he leaned forward from his chair and kissed her once, gently, and she kissed him back without hesitation, her hand coming up to rest against his jaw, and the prairie night was warm and enormous around them. The legal hearing took place in Dodge City on a Thursday in September of 1874. Oliver and Edna rode into town together at dawn, arriving at the courthouse, such as it was, a proper building put up just 2 years prior, with Shepard, who wore his best coat and had his documents in order. Pruitt was there with his own lawyer, a sharp-suited man from Wichita named Greer, and Wade Tanner sat in the back of the room with his hat in his lap and an expression of patient confidence that Oliver found aggravating. The proceeding lasted most of the morning. Shepard made his arguments clearly and well: the homestead precedents, the questionable terms of the original lending agreement, the documentation of continuous cultivation and occupancy. Greer was skilled and pushed back hard on every point, and there were moments when Oliver, sitting beside Edna in the gallery, felt the outcome go uncertain. Edna sat straight-backed and entirely composed throughout, which Oliver had expected. But once, during a particularly difficult exchange when Greer was pressing on the debt figures, she reached over without looking at him and found his hand, and held it, and he held hers back, and neither of them moved for the rest of the proceeding. The judge, a spare, serious man named Harwood who had been brought down from the Northern Circuit, took a recess of 40 minutes. When he returned, he ruled in Edna Sullivan's favor on the grounds of homestead precedents, noting that the lending arrangement did not supersede the original claim, and that the bank's acceleration of the repossession process appeared motivated by factors external to the stated debt recovery. He ordered that the debt be restructured over a period of 3 years, with the harvest proceeds applied as the first payment. Pruitt received this with the controlled fury of a man who had expected to win and did not. Tanner left without speaking to anyone. Greer collected his papers and departed with the air of a professional who had given his best effort and had learned nothing to be ashamed of. Shepard shook Oliver's hand with a satisfaction that was as close to celebration as he ever came. Oliver turned to Edna, who was still sitting very still in the gallery, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, open, completely open, without any of the careful composure she used to protect herself, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears but was close to them. "It is yours," he said quietly. "Your land is yours." She stood up and pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment, and then she lowered them and said, in a voice that was steady with effort, "My father would have been very glad." Oliver thought of the photograph on the mantelpiece, the man and the woman and the small girl between them, and he said, "I think he would have." They walked out of the courthouse into the September afternoon, and Dodge City moved around them with its usual indifferent noise, horses and wagons on Front Street, the smell of dust and leather, and the distant sound of the saloon piano already going at midday. And Edna stopped on the boardwalk and turned her face up to the sun for a moment, eyes closed, and Oliver stood beside her and thought that he was entirely and unrecoverably in love with this woman, which was a thought he received with considerably more peace than he would have expected. They ate lunch at a small restaurant off the main street that Edna had never been to before. She looked at the menu with the focused attention she gave everything, and ordered pie as well as her main course with a decisiveness that made him smile. And they talked about the farm, about the harvest proceeds, about the debt schedule, and then, without planning it, about everything after. "What will you do?" Edna asked, looking at him across the small table with her coffee cup in both hands. "About work, I mean." "Now that I have been thinking about that," Oliver said. He had, in fact, been thinking about it for weeks. Clem Hatcher wants to sell his sheep operation and retire. He has made me a fair offer on the flock and the pasture rights, which is a smaller investment than I thought. He paused. "And your north pasture along the creek, you have said yourself it is not being used for cultivation." Edna looked at him. She was very still. "You are asking about my north pasture," she said. "I am asking," he said, and his voice was careful and clear, "whether I might graze sheep on it, in exchange for a share of the proceeds, and for the labor of someone who would be on the property and available to help with the farm work." He looked at her steadily. "And also, if you are willing, in exchange for the company of a man who is very much in love with you and would consider it the greatest piece of luck in his life to be near you." The restaurant was small, and it had other patrons, and the proprietress was making no particular effort not to listen, and Oliver was aware of all of this, and found that he did not care at all. Edna Sullivan put her coffee cup down with great precision and looked at him across the table in the September afternoon light and said, "Oliver Covington, you are proposing to graze sheep on my pasture as a form of courtship." "I am proposing to graze sheep on your pasture," he said, "and to court you by every means available to me, separately but simultaneously." She was quiet for a moment, and then that real smile, the warm one, the rearranging one, broke fully across her face, and she said, "The pasture is available. And so, I suppose, am I." He reached across the small table and took her hand, and she turned hers over to hold his properly. And outside on Front Street Dodge City went on being loud and complicated, and neither of them paid it the slightest attention. The autumn of 1874 on the Sullivan farm was the most beautiful season Oliver had ever known, and he had known some beautiful seasons. He bought Clem Hatcher's sheep, a modest flock, but a good one, and negotiated the pasture arrangement with Edna over the kitchen table one evening, with both of them making careful notes in her ledger, which was the most romantic business meeting he had ever attended. He moved his lodging from Hatcher's spare room to a small added structure at the back of the Sullivan barn, which he and Edna rebuilt together over 2 weekends with timber from the Cottonwood Grove and some advice from Douglas Chen's eldest son, who had a practical knowledge of carpentry. The work of the farm in autumn was different from the summer, harvesting the kitchen garden, preparing the soil for the following year, maintaining the fence lines before the winter hardened the ground. Oliver learned it alongside Edna, and she was a patient teacher who did not condescend, and who was genuinely pleased when he mastered something new, which she showed by a particular tilt of her head and a look of quiet satisfaction that he found he worked hard to earn. The courtship was the kind that people in 1874 Kansas conducted openly and honestly, because there were no particular opportunities for anything else, and because neither of them was inclined toward games. They rode together in the evenings when the farm work was done, following the creek north through the cottonwoods until the light went gold and then purple, talking. They borrowed books from each other and left notes inside the covers. They cooked supper together more evenings than not, which required negotiation because they each had opinions about how things should be done, and the negotiation was excellent. She was cooking one evening in early November when she turned from the stove and said, with no particular preamble, "I love you, Oliver." Just that, plain as weather, the way she said everything important. He set down the coffee cups he had been moving from the shelf to the table and looked at her in the lamplight of the kitchen, and he said, "I have loved you since the morning I rode up that road and saw you working in the field and could not bring myself to do the one thing I had ridden out there to do. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and put her hands against his chest, and he put his arms around her. And they stood that way for a long time in the warm kitchen, with the supper going on the stove and the November wind moving against the windows. He asked her to marry him on a Sunday in December, standing at the edge of the north pasture where the sheep were grazing in the winter grass, with the sky the particular clear winter blue of Kansas, and his breath making small clouds in the cold air. He had thought about doing something elaborate, and then decided that Edna Sullivan was not a woman who needed elaborate things, that she was a woman who valued honesty and plainness and realness. And so he simply stood beside her at the fence and said that he wanted to spend his life with her, that he wanted to be her husband and her partner, and that he would work every day of that life to deserve the trust she placed in him. She said yes with the same directness with which she said everything, and then she pulled him down by the lapels of his coat and kissed him thoroughly and at length, there in the December field with the sheep watching with mild interest and the winter sun bright and cold. They married in the spring, April of 1875, when the wildflowers were coming in along the creek, and the wheat was newly planted, and the farm smelled of turned earth and possibility. The ceremony was simple, performed by the circuit preacher who came through every season, held on the porch of the Sullivan farmhouse with Shepherd as witness, and Douglas Chen's family in the yard and Clem Hatcher in his good coat, which he had clearly pressed for the occasion, and which touched Edna visibly when she saw it. Edna wore her best dress, the blue one, the one that had been faded when Oliver first saw her in it, and which she had carefully mended and altered for the occasion, with a bit of lace at the collar that had been her mother's. She carried a handful of wildflowers from along the creek. She looked, Oliver thought, as he stood facing her on the porch in the April morning, like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. And this was not a thought he had expected to have, and would not have been able to express to anyone without considerable embarrassment. But it was true, and he knew it was true. When the preacher said his words and Oliver said his, and Edna said hers in a voice that was clear and steady and utterly certain. And when it was done, Shepherd clapped quietly, and Clem Hatcher actually produced a whoop that was wildly at odds with his usual solemn demeanor, and the Chen family brought out food that they had apparently been preparing for days, and the spring morning broke open into a celebration that was small and warm and exactly right. The first year of their marriage was both harder and better than Oliver had imagined, which he supposed was the truth of most marriages. The farm work was relentless. There was always something broken, always something that needed attending, always the weather to contend with. The winter of 1875 was brutal, a Kansas blizzard that came in February and kept them snowbound for 11 days, during which they burned through their wood supply faster than expected, and Oliver spent 2 days digging the sheep out of a drift that had covered half the pasture, and Edna developed a cough that frightened him badly before it cleared. But the blizzard also meant 11 days inside the farmhouse, snowed in together, and those 11 days became some of Oliver's most vivid memories. The warmth of the fire and the lamp, Edna reading aloud in the evenings from whatever book she was working through while he repaired tack or sharpened tools, the way the storm made the world very small and very complete, just the two of them inside the light while the snow came down outside. They talked in those days about everything they had not yet talked about the future, about whether they wanted to expand the farm or the flock or both, about the possibility of children, which was a conversation they approached with the same honest directness they brought to everything. Edna said she wanted children, but was not willing to pretend she was not afraid of it, given that her mother had died on the journey to Kansas, and the frontier was not gentle with women in childbirth. Oliver said that he understood, and that whatever she felt was the right thing for them he would support without reservation, and then he said that he thought she would be a remarkable mother, which was not pressure but simply his honest observation, and she looked at him for a moment and then laughed, and said that he was not wrong. Their son was born in the winter of 1876, in January, in the room off the kitchen that had been Gerald Sullivan's before it became Edna and Oliver's. Edna was 27 and Oliver was 30, and the labor was long and difficult enough that Oliver spent a significant portion of it in a state of controlled terror, which he attempted to conceal, and at which he was not entirely successful. The woman who came to assist, a settler from the next valley named Ruth Garrett who had delivered half the babies in the county, told him firmly to stop pacing and be useful, and he found something useful to do, and at the end of it there was a son. They named him Gerald for Edna's father, and William for Oliver's uncle in Indiana, who had been the closest thing to a father Oliver had known after his own parents died of fever when he was 12. Gerald William Covington arrived in the world with a considerable quantity of dark hair and his mother's stubborn jaw and his father's gray eyes, and he was placed in Oliver's arms while Edna rested, and Oliver stood by the window in the January morning light holding this small, extraordinary person, and felt something in his chest so enormous and terrifying and joyful that he had no category for it. Edna, watching from the bed with her hair down and exhaustion clear on her face, said softly, "Well." "Well," Oliver said, and his voice was not entirely steady, "he is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen." "He looks like you," Edna said, "around the eyes." "He has your jaw," Oliver said. "He is going to be absolutely certain he is right about everything." Edna laughed quietly and said, "As long as he is actually right about things, I do not see the problem." The years settled around them like good weather, not without storms, but fundamentally benevolent, a life being built by two people who were genuinely suited to the work of building together. The farm grew. The flock grew. The debt to the bank was paid off in full by the autumn of 1877, the final payment carried into Dodge City by Oliver on a Thursday morning with Edna's careful receipt book in hand. And when the bank officer stamped the ledger and wrote "paid satisfied" in red ink, Oliver rode home that afternoon with the paper on his lap, and a feeling of completion so satisfying it was almost physical. Harlan Pruitt had left the bank by then. There had been some irregularities uncovered in his land transactions that the bank's head office in Kansas City had found problematic, and he had departed Dodge City with considerably less ceremony than he had arrived with. Wade Tanner still ran cattle through the territory, but the Sullivan land along the creek was no longer of particular interest to him, as the corridor he had actually wanted had been acquired elsewhere. The world had moved on, as it always did, making all that urgency and threat seem retrospectively less enormous than it had felt at the time. The farm in 1878 was almost unrecognizable from the struggling homestead Oliver had ridden to 4 years earlier. The fields were larger, better fenced, more productive. The barn had been properly rebuilt with good timber, large enough to hold both the horses and Oliver's expanded flock. The farmhouse had a proper addition on the south side. 2 new rooms that Oliver and Douglas Chen's sons had framed up over the course of a warm September, adding a proper bedroom for young Gerald, and a room that would eventually be needed for whoever came after. The kitchen garden was larger than ever, because Edna had a relationship with growing things that Oliver found astonishing. She could coax productivity from soil that other settlers had given up on, and her kitchen in autumn was a kind of glory, shelves of preserved tomatoes and beans and corn and fruit that she had traded for from the orchards that had appeared in the river valleys. Gerald was 2 years old and deeply motivated, as 2-year-olds are, to get into everything that was dangerous and interesting, which on a working farm included a considerable variety of things. Oliver had built a small fence around the well and another around the sheep pen, not to keep the sheep in, they were well trained, but to keep Gerald out, who had decided that sheep were his particular friends and needed to be visited constantly. Oliver would watch his son standing at the fence, small hands gripping the rails, having what appeared to be serious conversations with the ewes, and would think of what Edna had told him about her father talking to horses, and the line of it from her through her son made him feel the full length and continuity of things. Edna was in the garden one October morning in 1878 when she called Oliver over from the fence line he was mending, and when he walked over she took his hand and placed it over her stomach and looked at him with that direct hazel gaze and said, "Again." He stood in the October morning with his hand warm against her through the fabric of her dress and felt the world open up another increment, as it had a habit of doing around this woman, always wider and warmer than he had expected. "Are you well?" he asked, because he always asked this first. "I am well," she said. "Ruth Garrett will come when the time comes. I know what to expect now." She paused. "I am not afraid this time." He pulled her gently in and held her in the October garden, and over her shoulder the fields were gold and amber in the autumn morning, and Gerald was at the sheep fence conducting his important conversations, and the creek ran clear and cold along the north border of the land that was theirs, all of it theirs, fully and completely and without question. Their daughter arrived in May of 1879, born in the spring with considerably less difficulty than Gerald had been, as if she were more eager and more practical about the whole enterprise. She had Edna's auburn hair and a pair of lungs that made her opinions heard from some distance, which Ruth Garrett said was an excellent sign, and which Oliver suspected would remain characteristic. They named her Clara Frances for Oliver's mother, whom he had lost so young that her name was more image than memory. A woman in a blue dress standing in an Indiana doorway, and giving his daughter that name felt like a conversation across a long silence. Gerald received his sister with the serious interest of a 3-year-old, presented with something new and potentially interesting, and then decided that she was less immediately useful than the sheep, but probably had potential, which Edna received with great amusement and Oliver received with the specific love that a father feels when his child is ridiculous in a particularly charming way. By 1880, the Sullivan farm, which was officially registered now as the Covington farm, though Edna had kept Sullivan on her own name in the record books in her father's honor, which Oliver had supported immediately and without question, was one of the more prosperous small farms in their section of Kansas. Not wealthy, not vast, not the kind of operation that employed dozens of hands or shipped thousands of head of cattle, but solidly productive, debt-free, growing carefully and steadily, the way things grow when they are tended by people who understand them and love them. Oliver was 34. Edna was 31. Gerald was 4 and Clara was nearly 1, and the farmhouse was full of the specific good noise of a family boots on the wood floor, the baby's commentary on everything, Gerald's stream of questions, the sound of the stove and the smell of coffee in the mornings. Oliver found, in the settled happiness of this life, something he had not known he was missing, not just the contentment which was real and deep, but the feeling of being known. Edna knew him with an accuracy that was sometimes startling, the way she could read from the set of his shoulders whether he had had a difficult day with the flock, or from the quality of his silence at supper whether something was working in him that he had not yet resolved. She knew when to ask and when to let things sit, and she was equally willing to be known herself, which was a gift he did not take lightly. This woman who had spent years fortified in self-sufficiency, who had trained herself to need very little, choosing to be known by him. He still thought about the morning he had ridden up that road with the repossession notice in his pocket, and the way the sight of her working alone in the field had stopped him cold. He thought about it sometimes in the evenings when they sat on the porch, the same porch she had been on the day they met, and the fields were going dark, and the stars were coming up, and the coyotes were starting up in the distance, and the children were inside asleep, and the farm was quiet. One evening in the summer of 1880, they sat on the porch after supper with the long evening light going amber over the wheat, which was nearly ready to cut for the 3rd time without debt, and the 2nd time with their children sleeping inside, and Oliver said, "Do you think about that first day much?" Edna was quiet for a moment, her chair rocking slowly. "Often," she said. I saw you coming down the road and I knew from the set of you that it was bank business, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing my father was afraid of, arriving finally." She paused. "And then you stood at the fence and removed your hat, and you were so careful about how you said things, and I thought, he does not want to do this." "I did not want to do it," Oliver said. "I know." She looked at him. "I knew it that day. I thought, this man is fighting with himself. And I thought that was interesting." The corner of her mouth lifted. "I have always found men who fight with themselves interesting. It means there is something to fight about." Oliver laughed. "And men who do not fight with themselves are either very simple or very frightening," she said. "And I have had enough of both." He reached over and took her hand on the armrest of the chair, and she wove her fingers through his, and they sat in the warm evening and watched the summer light move across the fields. "I was going to mail the notice," he said. "On the ride back that first day, I told myself I would mail it." "I know," Edna said. "How do you know?" "Because you never did," she said. "And if you had been able to, you would have. You are not a man who leaves things undone out of carelessness." She squeezed his hand. "You left it undone because you could not do it. I understood that. I just did not know, that first day, whether it meant anything beyond decency." "When did you know it meant more than that?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "When you came back the second time," she said. "You had no particular reason to come yourself. A letter would have done. But you came yourself, and you stood at the fence and told me what the bank had agreed to, and you were so careful not to ask for anything in return that it was very clear that you wanted something in return." She smiled. "And so I invited you in for coffee." "A strategic move," Oliver said. "Everything is strategic," Edna said cheerfully. "I am a farmer. Farmers are strategic." She paused. "Besides, I wanted to know you. I had been alone a long time. I wanted very much to know you." The summer wind moved through the wheat, and the evening birds called along the creek, and somewhere in the farmhouse behind them, Clara made a sound in her sleep and then was quiet again, and Gerald, dependable in his early sleeping habits, made no sound at all. "I am glad I was not able to do it," Oliver said quietly. "Deliver the notice. I am glad every day." "So am I," Edna said simply. They sat on the porch until the stars were full out and the air had gone cool, and then went inside to the lamplight and the evening quiet of their house. The years that followed ran together in the good way, the way years do when life has found its proper shape. Clara grew into a child of considerable character and independent opinion, which surprised no one. Gerald, at 6 and 7 and 8, developed a serious interest in the sheep that progressed from companionable conversation to genuine competence. He had an instinct for the animals that Oliver recognized as a real aptitude, and he began teaching his son the practical work of managing a flock with the same patient, thorough approach that Edna had always used in teaching Oliver the farm's rhythms. They added a proper parlor to the farmhouse in 1882, the year Oliver turned 36. Because Edna had decided that 7 years of conducting all household life in the kitchen was sufficient, and that they were prosperous enough now to have a room that was not the kitchen. Oliver built the shelves for her books himself, taking considerable care with the joints and the finish, and when he was done, Edna ran her hands along the shelves with an expression of such genuine satisfaction that he went out and immediately started planning how to make them wider. The farm's reputation in the county was good. They were known as reliable, honest dealers. When Oliver sold wool, the weight was always accurate. When Edna brought her preserved goods to the county fair that had started up in Dodge City, they regularly came back without prizes only if she had not bothered to enter, which happened when she was too busy, which was often. Douglas Chen had become a genuine friend over the years, and his family were regular visitors, and Clem Hatcher, who had retired as planned but proved terrible at doing nothing, had taken to spending Sunday afternoons at the farm, ostensibly to check on the flock he had sold Oliver, actually to drink coffee and argue amiably with Edna about the novels she was reading, which he disapproved of on principle and read voraciously when she lent them to him. Oliver thought sometimes about his years of restlessness. The years after the war, when he had moved from one place to another with the feeling that he was always just short of wherever he was supposed to be. He thought about how straightforward the answer had turned out to be once he had stumbled into it. A piece of land in Kansas, a woman in a wheat field, a choice he had made not because it was wise or practical or professionally advisable, but because something in him had simply refused to do the wrong thing. He did not regret the years of movement. He thought they had made him someone Edna could trust, someone who had lived enough of the world to choose this part of it with intention rather than by default. But he was glad they were done. He was deeply, thoroughly, rootedly glad. The spring of 1883 brought a late frost that threatened the young wheat, 3 days of cold that came in April when the shoots were already up, and Oliver and Edna and Gerald, who was 7 now and entirely serious about farm work, spent those 3 nights moving through the field with lanterns, doing what could be done, which was not much but was not nothing. The field came through with some losses but mostly intact, which Gerald declared was because they had been diligent, and which Edna said was true, and which Oliver said was partly diligence and partly luck, and which Gerald considered and then revised his position to allow for, which showed a growing quality of mind that Oliver found very encouraging. That same spring, Edna told him she was expecting again. Their 3rd child arrived in November of 1883, a second son, whom they named James after no one in particular, but because the name suited him. A solid, cheerful name for a solid, cheerful baby who arrived in the world already seeming pleased to be there, which was either a temperamental quality or optimism, and possibly both. James had Oliver's dark hair and Edna's hazel eyes and Clara's tendency to have opinions about everything, which meant the farmhouse became considerably louder. Oliver stood in the doorway of the bedroom one evening when all 3 children were inside, and the noise they collectively generated had reached a level that was technically domestic, but approached something else, and he looked at Edna, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her ledger open and a cup of tea at her elbow, conducting the farm's accounts with focused precision, while the storm of children moved around her. And she looked up and met his eyes, and they both laughed at the same moment for the same reason, which was that this was their life, and it was perfect and ridiculous and completely theirs. He crossed the kitchen and bent to kiss the top of her head, and she turned her face up and he kissed her properly, and Gerald said not at the table from the next room in the tone of a child who has developed strong opinions about appropriate public displays of affection, which Edna found hilarious and Oliver found gratifying. The debt was long paid. The land was theirs, clear and legal and permanent. The fields were productive. The flock was healthy. The children were growing. The farmhouse was full. Some evenings, when the work was done and the children were settled and the farm was quiet in the way that farms go quiet when everything is in order, Oliver would sit on the porch in whatever season it was, the hot summer dark, or the cool autumn evening, or the sharp cold of a clear winter night, and think about the road that had led him here. The war and Indiana and the years of moving and the desk at the bank, and the morning he had saddled his bay gelding and ridden out with a notice in his pocket, and no idea that the road would end here on this porch, with this life. He thought about the choice he had made at the fence, the moment when he had sat on his horse looking at a woman working alone in a field and felt something refuse inside him, some fundamental refusal to do the expedient thing. He had not known in that moment that it was the most important choice he would ever make. He had only known that he could not do it. He had ridden away without delivering the notice, and everything had followed from that. Edna came out to the porch one such evening in the summer of 1884, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and settled into her chair beside him with the ease of 10 years of evenings on this porch, and handed him his cup and looked out at the fields in the late light. "Gerald told me today," she said, "that he wants to expand the north pasture when he is older. Did he say what he wants to expand it for?" "Sheep," she said, with a warmth in her voice that was entirely indistinguishable from pride. "He says your current flock is not operating at maximum efficiency relative to the available grazing area." She glanced at Oliver. He is 8 years old. He is a remarkable child, Oliver said. He is your child, she said in the tone that meant this was meant as a compliment. He is your child too, Oliver said. He has your certainty. Your steadiness, she said, your stubbornness. Your patience, she said. She paused. We have made a very good child. We have made 3 very good children, Oliver said. She smiled at him over her coffee cup. The full, warm smile. The real one. The one that had not changed in 10 years except to become more familiar and more beautiful. And he smiled back. And the summer evening moved over the fields, and the creek ran cool and clear along the north border of the land, and the stars came up one by one over Kansas. The Sullivan land, the Covington farm, stood solidly against the prairie sky, its fences mended, its fields green and growing, its house bright with lamp light. It had been nearly taken from her, and it had been saved, and it had become something neither of them could have predicted from the beginning. Not just land, not just a farm, but the ground on which a life had been built. A shared life, chosen freely, worked for honestly, and loved completely. Oliver set his coffee cup on the porch rail and reached over and took Edna's hand, and she gave it to him without looking away from the fields, because she had long since stopped needing to look to find him. He was there. He was always there. Oliver, she said after a while, I am glad you could not do it. He looked at her in the evening light, his wife, his partner, this woman who had remade his life by simply being herself on a morning in Kansas, working her field alone and refusing to be afraid. So am I, he said quietly. Every day of my life I am glad. The night settled over the farm, and the children slept, and the sheep were still in the north pasture, and the wheat stood ready in the fields, and the creek ran on. And Oliver and Edna sat on their porch in the good dark, together, in the life they had made from the unlikely miracle of one man's inability to do the wrong thing.